Early this morning, Novara Media were taken down by YouTube. There was plenty of cross-party outrage, a huge amount of social media buzz, and finally YouTube relented. It was precisely the big tech company free speech attack that plenty on the left, including members of the Novara team, revel in when it happens to those on the right. Join me and Guido editor Paul Staines as we take you through the events of the day. Early this morning, Novara Media put out a statement saying that their YouTube channel had been deleted without warning or explanation. Guido didn't have any reason to doubt this because, in fact, it happened to Talk Radio's YouTube channel earlier in the year. And once again, shortly after a huge amount of public outrage, the channel was reinstated. Guido, The Spectator, The Sun, Unheard, Julia Hartley-Brewer, David Davis took up the fight on behalf of Novara Media, along with all their left-wing online minions, and we got the channel reinstated because, for us, free speech works both ways. And we argued that even though we have huge political disagreements, they surely have to have the right to put out the content they want on YouTube without having to constantly look over their shoulder in fear that YouTube might arbitrarily take away that right from them. So the channel came back online at about 2 o'clock, but of course beyond the process of actually getting the channel back and the fact that it was done without warning, and as we record about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we understand Novara still haven't had an explanation from YouTube. It does open up a whole can of worms, doesn't it, Paul, about the potential hypocrisy of the left when it comes to free speech, a right to an online social media platform, which they've talked about many times over the last few years.
Well, I think the difference in attitude was best summarised by their media editor, who tweeted out a few months ago or last year when Trump was deplatformed, "No one has a right to a platform." In fact, I think we might have the tweets to hand. So there you see, he's gloating when someone else is deplatformed, but when it happens to them, it's a different matter. I think the lack of consistency isn't a surprise because the left, apart from the libertarian left, have a very confused attitude towards this because they see free speech as something dangerous when it says things that they don't agree with. And in that case, they think it's almost violent. I mean, you hear them in college campuses talk about it's a microaggression when someone says something they don't like and that it's harming them in some way. Well, you don't have a right not to be offended. You don't have a right not to hear things you don't like. But people do have a right to free speech. And that dichotomy for the left is always going to be problematic unless they return to an age gone past where people like George Orwell, who believed in freedom of speech for even people you don't disagree with. And traditionally that was a left-wing position. But something's happened since the last couple of decades where it starts on campuses and they don't tolerate things they don't like and they don't want to hear.
I think the reaction's been very interesting. Just before we sat down to record this, Ash Sarkar and Michael Walker, both of Novara, appeared on Owen Jones's YouTube channel ahead of a video that Novara themselves are going to be putting out at about 5 o'clock.
This isn't an example of cancel culture. When people are talking about cancel culture, what they're talking about are the informal mechanisms of outrage, which either then serve to curtail somebody's access to a platform or have them being sanctioned in some other way, like losing their job. All right. Now, we've actually had some really, I think, quite critical discussions about cancel culture, where we've talked about the fact that, it doesn't exist necessarily in the way that the right seem to be using it. Right. But we have also talked about, well, where are the limits in terms of being able to expect somebody to lose their job because they've said something which is transphobic or they've said something which is racist. There is not, I think, a clear and easy line here. And it is something that should be critiqued and negotiated and careful attention paid. I think that's perfectly fine.
And what I thought was really interesting is, these opinion writers on the left, they spend an awful lot of time in education at university. They really think about these issues, and often they have an answer for everything. Now, I agree with almost all of them, but they do think they have an answer for everything. But they got into the meat of the issue, which is, where is the line between acceptable free speech and the right of big tech, companies like YouTube to clamp down on that? And they didn't actually have an answer. They talked about Donald Trump. They talked about people like, the sort of far-right conspiracy theorists in America. And all they could say was, there are questions to be answered. Ash Sarkar floated the idea of a sort of democratic accountability for these online tech companies, but they don't have an answer, because ideologically the position is completely inconsistent, because they have built an ideology on free speech around the presumption that trendy left-wing views are safe, so they would never have to confront this particular issue, whereas they can they can justify, certain right-wing speech incites violence, or if you say something unacceptable on Twitter, well, it's a private company. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to have you on their platform. As the one of the digital editors' tweets that we brought up earlier said, you don't have a right to a Twitter account. Well, you can extend that. You don't have a right to a YouTube account. And it's particularly difficult for Novara, because they were just on a BBC podcast. Aaron Bastani was on a BBC podcast a few weeks ago, basically saying that a large plurality of their revenue, if not a majority, now comes from YouTube. And of course, that is quite a dangerous business model when you're putting out a lot of content, via a third-party platform like YouTube, and it isn't mainly built on ads as we do at Guido. You can't control that. Then you've got to abide by other people's editorial standards, which I personally wouldn't like to work to on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I mean, with YouTube, we had an example where we had a clip of Nadine Zahawi, when he was the vaccines minister, saying something innocuous about vaccines, which was government policy and presumably was in agreement with the science. And YouTube's algorithm took it down and put a COVID misinformation warning up on it, which was quite confusing. So it's dangerous when they have these algorithmic solutions. But rewinding a little bit, the philosophical difference between the left and right, it isn't really easy on the right either. My line in the sand on freedom of speech was, if you're not inciting violence, then anything goes. But then there is the traditional problem of, if you're shouting fire in a crowded theatre, do you have a right to do that when you can cause problems? And I think with COVID and misinformation, you are getting to that kind of territory, shouting fire in a theatre, which is going to harm the theatre goers, or in this case, the YouTube watchers. But it makes very hard decisions for the people at the other end, at the big tech platforms, or what they're going to do. They're under pressure from the regulators and government to stop all this disinformation and online abuse that politicians aren't enjoying receiving, which is making the whole issue blurred. If you think back a few years, was it 2012 when we had the Arab Spring, we were all going on how great it was that we had YouTube and Twitter to distribute that kind of, to allow that kind of rebellion and anti-government movements to begin. Then you fast forward it to 2020, and Trump's QAnon Patriot Boys, whatever they're called, are leading a attack on the Capitol building, and it's not such a popular idea anymore.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the Arab Spring was a prime time, I remember, for people defending the right, for example, to anonymous Twitter accounts, which are now under attack. We've also got the online harms bill, which is particularly worrying, I know, to a lot of our friends in the wonk world, in the libertarian Tufton Street buildings that I often frequent, because unfortunately, while Nadine Dorries does talk the talk on a lot of the issues we do, BBC and free speech and all that, she has also got, she was as a previous mental health minister, nurse, she is very concerned about the online abuse that is going on social media, and I think that's leaning her into pursuing the online harms bill, which gives social media this duty of care, which seems to really lean into that whole free speech attack that we've already seen the beginning of. So arguably, I can't see things getting better anytime soon. I think they're just going to carry on getting worse. But hopefully, so long as the evil right-wing media that Novara constantly do down day after day, stand up for free speech and stand alongside our comrades in their time of need, then hopefully we will continue to see YouTube reinstating these unfairly taken down YouTube channels, and that's all we can do.
There is an obvious solution. I don't want to get too geeky, which is decentralized social media, where you have platforms that are open source and open web, that you can control your own platform, and yet the platforms interact with other platforms. So if you have an open Twitter analogy, if you have an open site where you can have Twitter-like functions, but you actually own the platform, control the platform, and it's hosted on your server, and people can follow from their server, your server. It sounds quite complicated, but it is actually something that is possible and does work. And it has the advantage that as long as you've got control of the actual physical hardware, it's hard for government or big bad Google, Facebook, or Amazon to shut down. And I think in the future, that's the direction people will go, particularly as the hardware becomes really cheap and broadband bandwidth becomes almost free. Then we'll all have our own platforms that will interact and will behave like social networks, but actually you won't be able to be deleted. You'll still be able to block people you don't want to hear from, but you won't have your platform taken away from you. In much the same way that it's very difficult for anybody to take away our own website. I've gone to a lot of effort to make sure that our website will be protected with our First Amendment rights, because it's hosted in the States. And it's very difficult for people to attack us. Apart from on copyright, where interestingly the American recording industry and all that has got extraordinary powerful laws, whereas you can breach copyright, they can come and take away your website URL. And the American Supreme Court has backed that up. So that's why you've got to be careful about copyright. I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if it turns out that Novara Media infringed some copyright problem, and that is why their YouTube site was taken down. I don't know, but it's a possibility.
Well, there we are. Paul has given some very wonky ideas there that I'm sure Aaron Bastani and his fully automated luxury communist doctrine will incorporate with due diligence.
Well, automated autonomy seems to be something that should appeal to Aaron Bastani's mindset. It certainly appeals to mine.
Well, there'll be a second book soon, I'm very sure, for Aaron there. So we'll leave our audience to think over the day's events and our proposals about what could change going forward. And we will see you in our next Guido Talks. Thank you very much.